Let me. Hello, welcome back to the transformation of the global system. This week we'll be looking at global actors with a focus on security and terrorist networks. Now, what we'll examine is security in global politics, changing forms of warfare, terrorism and terrorist networks, globalization, its impact on security, and international efforts to combat terrorism. We'll argue that globalization and technological change have transformed warfare, terrorism, and international security threats. So let's start off by defining what is security. Now, the traditional view of security is as follows, that it focuses on protecting the state, defending territory, and military threats. Now, this is very much a realist perspective where they believe that security was a primary goal of states. The key idea was states seeking survival in an anarchic international system. And we see that security was originally understood mainly in the military sense. However, we've seen the expanded concepts of security. More modern concerns focus on issues that include terrorism, cyber attacks, environmental risks, pandemics, economic instability, and human security. Now, just to kind of talk a little bit more about human security, we find that it focuses on protecting individuals rather than only the states. And some of the examples of what is a focus of human security is issues of poverty, disease, political violence, and refugee crises. So we're seeing a shift from state security to human security. Now, we've also seen the changing nature of warfare. It's moved away from state-to-state conflict to, more of, from state-to-state conflict to, away from conventional armies and even territorial battles. We're actually seeing newer forms of warfare because globalization has transformed conflict. We're seeing the involvement of more non-state actors. We're seeing the use of asymmetrical warfare or conflict. There is the use of guerrilla warfare, cyber warfare, and even terrorist networks. So we're seeing that war is no longer fought only between states. Additionally, as a part of security measures, we're finding that there is again still a focus on nuclear weapons and security. Now, when we look at nuclear proliferation, that's basically the spread of nuclear weapons being a main concern globally. So the main issues that fall under this is that of deterrence, whether or not there's going to be arms races between different countries, what's the risk of going into a nuclear conflict as what we saw happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and rogue states that are acquiring nuclear weapons that shouldn't have it, or, not from the traditional set of countries that have it. So we're seeing with nuclear weapons, when we looked at what happened after World War II, it's actually changed global security, where we're either seeing an arms race happening, or there's trying to be deterrence to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that are still accessible, as well as just trying to restrict additional states from getting nuclear weapons. Now, what is terrorism? Terrorism, the general definition, involves the use of the threat of violence to create fear for political, ideological, or religious purposes. Some of the common features are violence against civilians, political objectives, psychological impacts, and media attention. It should be noted that even though I gave this general definition, there's still no universally accepted definition of terrorism. Now, what are the main types of terrorism? You have state terrorism, where there's violence that is carried out or sponsored by governments. There is also what we call non-state terrorism, where it's violence carried out by organizations or groups outside of the state, for example, extremist organizations, insurgency groups, and transnational networks. We're also seeing what we'd say are old and new terrorism happening, where old terrorism tended to focus on the usual nationalist or ideological perspectives, and they had very limited political goals and were more localized. New terrorism, on the other hand, is often religiously motivated, is built on transnational networks, have greater emphasis on mass casualties, and we see where global communication and recruitment plays a major role. So we're seeing that globalization has actually increased the international reach of terrorism. So what are some of the causes for globalization? For terrorism. There are several explanations. You have the cultural explanation, where the main argument is that terrorism may be seen as resistance against westernization, globalization, and materialism. The main thinker behind this was Samuel Huntington and his work, The Clash of Civilizations, where the argument is that culture and civilizational conflicts will shape global violence. For them, under this particular school, identity and cultural conflict are drivers of extremism. Then we have the economic explanation. Now, the main argument here is that terrorism may develop from inequality, exploitation, lack of opportunity, and resentment towards global capitalism. The main or key institutions that are mentioned in this argument tends to be the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And you find that, some studies have found that the link between inequality and terror is tenuous. Then the third is the religious explanation. This one says that modern forms of terrorism are linked to religious extremism and global jihad. The main features are a religious motivation, global ideological struggle, fight against infidels and apostates. So you find that religious terrorism differs from secular terrorism because deterrence works differently. Now, when we talk about globalization, technology, and terrorism, we find that globalization's role is really intricately linked to the changing way that terrorism occurs. When we look at terrorism and technology, we see where the internet and communication has allowed for online recruitment, propaganda, coordination, and communication with global audiences. This has led to better coordination where technology enables coordinated attacks, transnational networks, and encrypted communication. For example, using encryption, ciphers, and dead letters. We're also seeing greater mobility. Globalization allows for easier international movement. For example, using the Schengen Agreement in Europe. And it's also increased in lethality. Concerns include the use of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and advanced technologies. So we're seeing that globalization increases both connectivity and security risks. But how can we combat terrorism? Now, we could use international cooperation, where we see that there are several organizations that are helping to combat terrorism. These include the United Nations, Interpol, and the International Civil Aviation Organization. There are other ways we can approach it by looking at what are some of the counter-terrorism approaches. There's a war model that uses military force against terrorist groups, such as invasions, drone strikes, and military campaigns. And then there's also the law enforcement model, where it treats terrorism as a criminal activity. So the main methods that would be used are policing, intelligence sharing, arrest, and international legal cooperation. Now, the key debate in which model to use is how do we treat or how should we treat terrorism? Should we treat it mainly as war or a crime? Now, the challenges in combating terrorism are as follows. It's hard to identify terrorists, tracking networks, doing cross-border operations, and even balancing security and civil liberties. You find that globalization has changed the scale and reach of terrorism more than its basic nature. Some security perceptions is that, as we said before, perceptions strongly influence state decisions about war, peace, and threats. So security threats are not only objective, they can also be politically interpreted. So the takeaway from today's discussion is that globalization has transformed war and terrorism. Terrorism is shaped by cultural, economic, and religious factors, and international cooperation is essential for modern security challenges. Important terms to remember are security, human security, terrorism, new terrorism, nuclear proliferation, asymmetric warfare, global jihad, counterterrorism, deterrence, cybersecurity, and weapons of mass destruction. And I'll end today's discussion with this. Globalization has connected the world economically and technologically, but it has also transformed the nature of warfare, terrorism, and international security challenges. Thank you.